Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga on Friday announced that he wouldn't be running for the ruling party leadership's race at the end of the month, indicating that he's stepping down as the government leader. His resignation comes just a year after he took office, bringing an end to his tenure as the country battles a fifth wave of the coronavirus and a slow vaccination rollout. We discuss today what's next for Japanese politics as Mr. Suga heads towards the so-called revolving door of leadership change, through which the country saw 6 prime ministers come and go in the space of 5 years. For this, we connect with Ben Dooley, Japan correspondent for the New York Times, and Jonathan Berkshire-Miller, senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. It's lovely to see you back on the programme, both of you, and well, thank you so much for joining us. Well, to start with you, Ben, now it was big news over the weekend that we heard, and well, did Yoshihide Suga's decision not to run for the ruling Liberal Democratic Party's leadership come as a surprise to you? I mean, what's been the public and the local press reaction there?
The timing was a surprise, but the outcome wasn't necessarily surprising. I don't think anyone expected him to step down on Friday as he did. But at the same time, there was a growing sense of dissatisfaction with his leadership. He's been polling very badly recently, and his decision followed a week of these kinds of palace intrigues, lots of reports about his relationship with leaders within the party and how that was changing. He seemed to be waffling back and forth about whether he was going to call a snap election. And it seems that at the end of the week, he had lost the confidence of the party leaders who possibly forced him to step down. And we're not really sure what happened behind the scenes. But in any case, that timing was unexpected. I, for one, I know a lot of other people thought that he would stay through the Liberal Democratic Party's leadership election at the end of the month and then perhaps hope to see his poll numbers come up, and if not, then he might step down later. But the timing again was a complete surprise.
Right, and Ben, well, he started off with around 70% in the public's confidence, but now that's plummeted to around 30%. And well, how do you think he's handled state affairs over the last 12 months that he's been in office?
Well, that's a good question. He had a good start, I think. When he came into office, he concentrated on some of the bigger issues, such as decarbonization, dealing with Japan's low fertility rates, birth rates, those sorts of things. But I mean, obviously, the most pressing issue was COVID and the pandemic. And there was a real sense that the government fumbled its response to the pandemic and hasn't really done a particularly good job. One of the biggest questions, of course, was whether or not they should host the Olympics. He went through with that. It was a bit of a gamble. I think the idea when he came into office last year was that if the Olympics were a success, that would buoy him. In fact, quite the opposite has happened. While the Olympics were a technical success, they went off without a hitch. At the same time, the virus is really at its worst stage during the pandemic today. So his plan, I think, backfired to some extent. And as I said, slow vaccine rollout and just a real sense that more should have been done about the coronavirus.
Mm-hmm. And now, Jonathan, to bring you into the conversation, were you surprised by Mr. Suga's decision not to run for the LDP leadership?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on again. Yeah, I would agree very much with Ben's comments. I think in a tactical sense, there absolutely was a surprise. And I think on the specific timing, I think there's not many who follow Japanese politics that were expecting this to happen on that specific day or that specific week. I agree with Ben that I think that it was something that I thought that he would hang on for several weeks with the hope that his polling numbers could come up. So on the tactical side, the timing absolutely was a surprise. On the more strategic side, it doesn't surprise me at all. I think his polling numbers just despite his best efforts, you have to contextualize when Suga came into office a year ago. He was sort of seen by many not as a visionary, but largely as a caretaker sort of prime minister. He tried to shirk that label, but was unable to do that. And while he had a very brief period of decent approval and relatively high approval, that very quickly sunk as a result of his management of the coronavirus, and then, as Ben mentioned, the Olympics. So I think on those big strategic terms and on that level, it was not a surprise. But absolutely, the specific timing of this happening right now, I think, was surprising to most.
And Jonathan, when Mr. Suga replaced Mr. Shinzo Abe last year as Prime Minister, many hoped that he would continue introducing changes and reforms to government and society, as Ben briefly mentioned. But now that he's leaving, hugely unpopular, I mean, where does he stand within his party? And was his resignation something that was quite necessary for the party?
Yeah, I think in many senses this is the party signaling that it needs to move on, although largely on the broad areas that Suga focused on, whether this is foreign policy or whether this is domestic policy issues. He was very much in tandem with the former Abe administration. So, for example, on some of the regional security issues with regard to the Indo-Pacific, China, the U.S. alliance relationship, there was very little change and a lot of consistency from the Abe administration. But clearly, when the approval rating started falling below 30%, especially, it was no longer tenable for the LDP to continue supporting it.
Now, Ben, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, it's going to be choosing a new leader. And, well, then how will this procedure go about this month?
Well, first, they have to come up with a slate of nominations. Each candidate has to have 20 people from Diet members backing them to be considered or to be allowed to run for the presidency of the party. And then there'll be a general election at the end of the month. Sorry, not a general election, election among the party members and the Diet members at the end of the month. So the way it works is roughly half the votes for the candidate will come from the rank and file members of the party, and the other half will come from the Diet members who are in the party. There, I guess, are 6 or 7 plausible candidates, but I think only 4 people are seriously considering running. And we'll see. So far, 2 have definitively said they'll run, and I think we're expecting another 2. So the most popular candidate, I think, among the party members right now is Kono Taro, who's sort of a younger guy who has served as Foreign Minister and Minister of Defense most prominently, but currently he's in charge of the vaccine effort. He's extremely popular. He's kind of a sense that, or feeling that he's not of the mold, traditional kind of mold. Again, he's a younger guy, new generation. He's on social media, that sort of thing. There are a few other people who will also be running. I've seen in the clips here, we've seen some video of them. But I think Kono Taro is far and away the most popular. That said, there is a woman, Sanae Takaichi, who is, according to reports over the weekend, has the support of Prime Minister Abe, who's quite powerful in the party. So we'll see where she stands as the month goes on.
Right, so a great amount of interest on who's running, really, and who the frontrunners are. And, well, the main contenders for the leadership contest appear to be, as you mentioned, Taro Kono, former Foreign and Defence Minister, and also Fumio Kishida, who was also former Foreign Minister, and Internal Affairs Minister Sanae Takaichi, who you just mentioned. Well, Jonathan, who are you betting on among these 3 candidates?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, and I think Ben laid it out pretty interestingly too. And in many ways, this is sort of like Back to the Future. I mean, if you think about even when Abe was running as the LDP president, especially Kishida and Ishiba have had several kicks at the can and have indicated their interest in leadership several times before. I think Kono's a little bit new. I think Kono, there was thoughts that he might have interest the last time around, but at that point he decided to forego that and throw his weight behind Abe Shinzo. I clearly think he's one of the prohibitive favorites right now. And the interesting thing is not only is he favored in most of the public polling, but he's also favored by the faction. So I think having those 2 elements, the regional support, in addition to factional support, will be really significant. But there's still some time to go on it. So, I mean, I think there's Ishiba as well has really strong regional representation, even though within the biggest elements of the factional parties in the LDP, he's not the favored option. So I do think that there is still time on this, but I think at this point, Kono remains the favorite.
And Jonathan, many are actually questioning whether this means former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe will be making a return. I mean, how do you see the odds, and what kind of role do you think he's going to play in the party's future?
Well, Abe clearly is there, and not just in the background. I mean, he is a very omnipresent in all of these discussions. That being said, I think in my own sense here is that Abe will not be making a run or a surprise run during this election. I think if he's going to seek a third term as Prime Minister, this very likely will come in a subsequent election. So I think for this one, he's going to play more of the kingmaker behind the scenes. As Ben mentioned, he has a few favorite candidates that he's backing, and I'm sure that he'll keep his hands in the ring with the other candidates as well. So I think this is going to be Abe's position right now to sort of wait and see. But if the next LDP president fumbles within a year or year and a half, it'll be interesting to see how Abe positions himself at that point.
Well, Ben, the coming weeks are set to be a very exciting time in Japanese politics. And well, once a new leader, whoever it may be, takes office, what do you think are going to be the top challenges or agendas that they're going to be faced with upon entering office?
Well, I think obviously the biggest issue, as everywhere else in the world right now, is the coronavirus and how it's going to be handled. I think that the vaccine effort in Japan is going really well now. We have over 1 million doses being given every day, and whoever ends up becoming prime minister will, to some extent, hopefully, benefit from that effort, because I think we have now 50% of the population or more already has 2 doses, and we expect that most of the population, the government is saying that most of the population who wants to have the vaccine will have it by November. So we can imagine a future where the virus is hopefully largely under control. Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns about new variants and things like that, so we can't say for sure. If that's the case, then whoever comes into office will probably benefit from that. And then there are a lot of sort of longer standing issues, rising tensions with China, the digitalization of the government, which is a big issue for Mr. Kono. And again, falling birth rate can go on. There's a list of outstanding issues that the new Prime Minister will have to tackle. One of the big ones, I think, also is going to be what happens to Mr. Suga's decarbonization efforts. He promised to have Japan at a net neutral carbon by 2050, and I guess we'll have to see who takes office after him. But there's some question as to whether or not the next Prime Minister will follow through with those efforts, I think.
Well, it sounds like the next Prime Minister is going to have his hands quite full with domestic structural issues, the country's future, and also foreign relations. And well, speaking of foreign relations, Jonathan, with uncertainty ahead surrounding the LDP's leadership contest and South Korea's own presidential race next year, do you think bilateral ties are going to be put on the back burner yet again?
Well, I mean, I think you could see it in 2 ways. One, glass half full, one, glass half empty. I mean, unfortunately, I think when thinking about this relationship, it's often been the latter in recent years. But on the half full side, 2 of the candidates which would be favored to take over the LDP and become next Japanese Prime Minister are both foreign ministers, Kishida and Taro Kono. Taro Kono, in addition to his post as foreign minister, also was defense minister. Both have had interactions, several interactions with the South Korean side. But on the sort of the empty, side of this, most of their interactions, for example, Kishida, when he was foreign minister, was the counterpart signing the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement, which now has sort of fallen apart. So there's a lot of baggage, I think, from some of these top leadership candidates when it comes to South Korea. And then you sort of magnify that with, as you mentioned, the upcoming presidential election in South Korea. I don't think that there's going to be a risk-taking strategy from either if it's not one of those 2 leaders, even if it's Ishiba or Takaichi. I think that you're going to see a very different approach and a very risk-averse approach. Where most of the focus will be on sort of the tried and tested areas such as the Indo-Pacific, the U.S. alliance, and solidarity on China. So I think we're probably going to have to wait until after the South Korean presidential election. And at that point, we can see the political stability in Japan. And there might be an appetite for more risk-taking and a bit more visionary leadership on both sides. But at this point, I think it's going to be very, very, very risk-averse.
Thank you. That was Ben Dooley, Japan correspondent for the New York Times, and Jonathan Birchmiller, Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Thank you both again so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.